The weekend began calmly. Grandpa was visiting while my parents were away. I expected a peaceful time. He was elderly, so I anticipated quiet days, perhaps old films, maybe cards. Perhaps old films, maybe cards. Nothing unusual, I thought. I was wrong. The first evening went as planned. We ate, he shared tales, and I was almost ready for bed. But Grandpa had other ideas. Let's stay up later. He grinned mischievously. A look I hadn't seen before. It was like a sudden change. One moment, Grandpa was his usual kind, wise self. The next, he proposed a midnight dance party. I thought he was kidding, but suddenly, old songs from his younger days filled the room. He started dancing, and before I knew it, I was joining in. We were laughing, spinning around like children, but Grandpa's eyes held a special sparkle, a look I'd never seen before. It wasn't strange, but it wasn't the usual Grandpa feeling either. We danced until I was exhausted. "Okay, Grandpa, I'm done," I said, falling onto the sofa, completely breathless, expecting him to do the same. But he didn't. Instead, he sat down right next to me, a little closer than usual. "You've got some moves," he said, his voice a little lower than before. I chuckled, but my pulse quickened. That praise felt deeper than just my dancing. The following day was even weirder. Grandpa was already up, cooking breakfast, but not regular breakfast. He was making fancy pancakes. Like he wanted to wow someone. "Good morning, sunshine," he said with a wink. "Hope you're hungry," as we ate. He kept the conversation, the light, but every so often he'd drop a comment that felt off, things like, "You've really grown up," or "You remind me of someone I used to know." It was like he was seeing me differently, and I didn't know how to handle it. Was I imagining things, or was something really changing between us? Later that afternoon, we decided to go for a swim. The pool in the backyard was just too inviting, and the weather was perfect. I slipped into my swimsuit, thinking nothing of it. But when I came out to the Grandpa's gaze lingered a little longer than it should have. He didn't say anything, but the way he looked at me sent a chill down my spine. We swam for a while, and everything seemed normal, but as I climbed out of the pool, I noticed Grandpa watching me closely again. This time he didn't even try to hide it. His eyes followed every move I made, and I suddenly felt exposed in a way I hadn't before. I tried to shake it off. But then something happened that I couldn't ignore. As I was drying off, Grandpa swam up to the edge of the pool and pulled himself out. But as he did, his towel slipped, and for a brief moment, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. His tool was out, and he didn't seem too concerned about covering it up. I froze, my heart pounding. Was this an accident, or was this something else? He didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge it. He didn't even acknowledge it. He just smiled, almost like he knew exactly what he was doing that night. I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I reading too much into things, or was Grandpa crossing a line? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that things had changed between us, and I didn't know what to do the next morning. Grandpa was acting like nothing had happened. He made breakfast again, cracked a few jokes, and even suggested we go out for a drive later. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As we sat in the car, driving through the quiet streets, he reached over and put his hand on my knee. It was a small gesture, but it felt huge in that moment. My breath caught in my throat, and I didn't know whether to pull away or let it happen. "You know," he said, his voice soft but steady, "you've always been my favorite." I didn't know how to respond. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. What was happening? Was this just Grandpa being affectionate? Or was this something more? I looked at him, trying to get Annie's intentions, but the way he looked back at me with that same spark in his eye from the night before told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just affection. This was something else entirely. He squeezed my knee gently, his thumb brushing against my skin. "You're special," he said, his voice low and full of meaning. "Hope you know." That I swallowed hard, my mind spinning. Was I really about to let this happen, or was I strong enough to stop it before it went too far? Music as soon as Grandpa's hand rested on my knee. I felt a wave of heat rush through my body, and not the kind you expect on a quiet drive with your grandfather. My heart was racing, pounding in my chest, as if trying to warn me of what was coming next. His voice, low and steady, filled the car like an unspoken promise I didn't know whether to stop him or let it happen. "You're special here," whispered again, his thumb now tracing small circles on my leg, almost daring me to respond. I looked at him, trying to read his face. Was this really happening? My mind was spinning, trying to find a way out, but every time I thought of saying something, the words stuck in my throat. There was a part of me that didn't want to stop him, even though I knew I should. The air in the car felt thick, and I could hear my own breathing. "Grandpa." But before I could finish, he cut me off his hands, sliding further up my leg. His touch was soft, almost gentle, but there was something about it that made my entire body freeze. "I've always taken care of you, haven't I?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Now, you know, I'd do anything for you." His words hung in the air, and I realized the situation had escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. But I was trapped, torn between the family bond we shared and the undeniable tension that had been building all weekend. Suddenly, the car stopped. He pulled over to the side of the road, turning to face me. Fully, his eyes were intense, filled with a desire I didn't know how to handle it. "I need you to understand something," he said, his hand now resting firmly on my thigh. "What's happening between us? It's special." My breath caught in my throat. "Grandpa, we can't." But he didn't listen. He leaned in, closer, his face inches from mine, and I could feel his breath on my skin. My heart raced, every instinct in my body telling me to run, to escape, but I was frozen, paralyzed by the moment. And then, as if sensing my hesitation, he leaned back slightly, his grip loosening. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said, softly, his tone almost comforting. "But you have to trust me." The car was silent. I stared at him, searching for any hint of the man I had grown up with, the man who had always protected me. But the person sitting in front of me was someone different now. Someone who had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Just as I was about to respond, he leaned in again, this time slower, more deliberate. His hand brushed against my leg, sending shivers down my spine. I didn't know what to do. Should I pull away? Should I pull away? Should I let it happen? My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. But before I could decide, he spoke again. "You don't have to say anything." He whispered, his lips close to my ear. "Just let me take care of you, like I always have." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. There was no turning back now. I sat there, frozen, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a boulder. My mind was screaming for me to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him as he leaned in even closer, his hand still resting on my thigh. Seemed heavier than ever. "Just relax," Grandpa said, his voice softer now, almost soothing, like he was coaxing me into something I couldn't escape from his hands. Slid upward so slowly it was almost torturous. Suddenly a jolt of fear hit me like cold water. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I needed to get out of this situation fast. But how? What could I say that would stop him without making everything worse? My mouth felt dry, my heart beating so loudly in my ears that it drowned out any rational thought. I forced myself to speak, even though the words barely came out. "Grandpa, we can't. We shouldn't do this for a moment." There was silence. His hand paused, mid-motion, his eyes narrowing slightly. It was as if he was weighing my words, considering whether to listen or to push further. My breath caught in my throat, waiting for his response. But I didn't know if I was hoping he would stop or if something else was keeping me frozen. Then, to my surprise, he pulled back just a little. "You're right," he said, his voice low, but controlled. "I wouldn't want to force you into anything you don't want." A flicker of relief ran through me, but it was short-lived. His eyes still had that dark intensity, and I could sense that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He was playing with me now, toying with the situation, seeing how far he could push. Before I snapped, "I just want us to be close," he said, his hand resting again, this time without moving. "We've always had a special bond, haven't we?" I nodded slowly, my thoughts racing. How could he twist something like this? How could he twist something like this? How could he take what used to be innocent and warp it into something so dangerous? But even as those questions burned in my mind, I knew this was a moment I needed to escape. "I think we should head home," I managed to say, my voice shaky but firm. "This isn't the right place for whatever this is." Grandpa looked at me, his eyes scanning my face like he was trying to figure out if I was serious. There was a tension in the air, and I could feel the weight of his gaze. But then, as if deciding it wasn't worth it to push me further right now, he gave a small nod. "All right," he said, pulling at his hand away at last. "Well, head home. But remember, you can always talk to me about anything, you know that. Right?" I gave him a stiff nod, my heart still racing. The tension in the car hadn't lifted. But at least for now, the situation seemed to be diffused. But just when I thought I could finally breathe again, Grandpa said something that made my stomach drop. "When we get home," he began, his voice ticking on that soft, dangerous edge again, "maybe we can continue this conversation in private." My pulse quickened. Was he seriously suggesting this wasn't over, that he was planning to pick things up where we left off? Once we were alone at home, the thought made my skin crawl, and I knew I couldn't just let this slide. As he started the car and began driving back toward the house, I sat there in silence, my mind racing with thoughts of what I would do next. This wasn't just an awkward situation anymore. It was something far worse. I had to figure out a way to stop this, to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. But what would I say? How could I get through to him without making things worse? The drive back to the house was suffocatingly quiet. My heart raced in my chest, each passing second dragging on like an eternity. Grandpa didn't say much, just small talk about the weather, about how it was nice spending time with me. But I knew what was waiting once we got home. And it felt like an invisible clock was ticking down to something I wanted no part of. As we pulled into the driveway, a knot formed in my stomach. The house, once a place I felt comfortable, now felt like a trap. My mind screamed for a way out, some excuse, some reason to avoid being alone with him. But as Grandpa turned off the engine and the silence in the car became almost deafening, I realized I had to act quickly. "We could watch a movie when we get inside," Grandpa said, breaking the silence, his voice too casual for the tension that was boiling beneath the surface. "Just the two of us. You always used to love watching those old classics with me." My skin prickled at the thought of being in the dark living room, just the two of us, with him so close. I needed to find a way to keep him at arm's length. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think I'm just gonna head to bed when we get inside. I'm really tired. I lied, hoping that it would give me some space. "Maybe we can do something to tomorrow." Grandpa looked at me, his gaze lingering a little too long before he